Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York invites you to be the informed patient with a podcast that features experts from Central New York's only academic medical center. I'm your host, Amber Smith. Our muscles tend to atrophy as we age, but researchers don't have a complete understanding of how or why. A student researcher at Upstate is focused on the mechanism of muscle atrophy and aging, and he's here to tell us about it. Nicholas Brennan is a fellow in the MD-PhD program at Upstate's Norton College of Medicine. Welcome to the Informed Patient, Mr. Brennan.
Thank you very much for having me, Amber. I'm very excited to be here today.
Well, I understand you work in the lab of Dr. Zen-Ji Chen. Can you explain what Dr. Chen's lab focuses on?
Sure. So the Chen Lab focuses on how dysfunction of mitochondria, which are known to be the powerhouse of the cell, how when mitochondria don't function as they're supposed to, how that can lead to sickness during certain pathology or certain diseases, as well as during the normal aging process.
So you called them the powerhouse. Where are the mitochondria located?
The mitochondria are located in different sections of the cell, essentially. They're not in a very specific portion, but what I can say is that certain tissues have a higher number of them. And what you could think of is those types of tissues that are very metabolically active or they require a lot of energy, such as skeletal muscle or such as the heart muscle. Those types of tissues have many more mitochondria within the cell than maybe some other tissues that aren't as active.
I see. Now, what is mitochondrial dysfunction?
Yeah, so when you say mitochondrial dysfunction, you can really think of any condition that leads to mitochondria not working as they're supposed to. So when I say the powerhouse of the cell, what I mean is the mitochondria generate energy that the cell needs to carry out normal functions. And it produces something called ATP, which is, you could think of it as like an energy currency. If you want to move your muscles, if you want to walk to the fridge, you need to use ATP to be able to do that. So when you have mitochondrial dysfunction, one of the most well-known aspects could be reduced or lowered ATP production. So your cell doesn't get all the energy that it needs to function properly. And that's what mitochondrial dysfunction is most classically known as. But over the years, we've found that mitochondria do many more functions than just making energy. So it allows for cell signaling. So maybe the mitochondria can communicate with other parts of the cell to foster proper function. So what we know now is that when mitochondria are not working as well, it doesn't only affect the mitochondria and the energy, it really affects the entire cell, which has been recently appreciated.
Well, if it affects the entire cell, then does it affect the tissue? Is that what leads to the muscle atrophy?
Yes, and what I will say is, so you're exactly correct, Amber. So when you have dysfunctional or mitochondria that are not working, of course, what I have shown, along with many other groups, is that it can lead to muscle loss and muscle dysfunction, but it's also implicated in many other diseases. And some of the most commonly known diseases where mitochondrial dysfunction plays a role are neurodegenerative ones. So Parkinson's, which many people are familiar with, Alzheimer's, cancer, as well as even like genetic mutations. Mitochondrial dysfunction will play a role in that as well.
So it's usually or always caused by a disease, or could there be an injury that leads to mitochondrial dysfunction?
So there are certain cell stressors that can induce or cause mitochondrial dysfunction. And for example, mitochondrial dysfunction is found in the setting of like nutrient starvation, or as well as too much nutrition. So mitochondrial dysfunction is also found in the case of obesity, for example, and other inflammatory states. Right? We know that obesity is connected very tightly to inflammation, and we know that inflammation can negatively impact the mitochondria as well.
Well, can we talk about what happens to a cell when it is stressed? What causes cellular stress?
Cellular stress is very broad, right? So it can mean many things. One of the most well-known stress response pathways can involve DNA damage. So, they always tell you to wear sunscreen, for example. You go out into the sun, right? And for example, UV rays from the sun that can cause DNA damage to the skin, right? So that's one example in which the cell can be stressed is by UV damage. But then you can also have something called oxidative stress. And when I say that, that is very tightly linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. So I mentioned how the mitochondria make energy. If that energy making process is halted, that causes something called oxidative stress. And that has been very well studied to cause many different stress response pathways to be activated, as well as just harming other parts of the cell. So I mentioned DNA, for example, when mitochondria don't act as they should, it can actually oxidize the DNA. And oxidize is just essentially another mechanism of stress.
Has science proven that cellular stress plays a role in aging?
Oh, for sure. One issue in terms of how cellular stress can lead to aging, of course, the actual stress is harmful to the cell. But what we find is a lot of the negative impacts of cellular stress is related to the stress response. So, how the cell actually handles the stress and what the cell does to compensate. And we find that that response over time can be very detrimental to the cell health as well as contribute to the aging process, right? Because you could think, for example, with UV damage, like the sun damage, the cell can respond very quickly to try to mitigate that stress. But many times, if that stress is chronic, like we see in aging, that prolonged activation of stress response pathways, which are helpful if they're activated in the short term, but long term could actually negatively impact human health. And that's what you see a lot with aging is these prolonged activations of these pathways that are meant to keep the cell happy, but over a long time, it's actually negatively impacting.
So it's the chronic stress that we sort of worry more about. What does chronic stress do to our muscles?
One thing you could think of with chronic stress is the cell. If the cell has a chronic stress where it was able to maybe handle it well in the beginning, maybe when we're young and young muscle, but over time, if the muscle can no longer handle this, one response is that the muscle cells will enter, or even really any cells will enter a stage called senescence, which is essentially shutting down of cell growth and cell proliferation. And that's the body's way of saying, hold on, we can't be making more cells if we already can't be handling the ones we have already. So at the time, the body thinks that's a good thing to do. But in muscle, that's very important for aging because muscle stem cells or that proliferative nature of the muscle cell allows us to repair muscle when it's damaged and when you lose that capability, that's when you start to see some of this muscle pathology that is accompanied by the normal aging process.
This is Upstate's The Informed Patient podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. I'm talking with Nicholas Brennan. He's a fellow in the MD PhD program at Upstate's Norton College of Medicine. Well, please tell us about your research. What are you working on now?
Sure. So I mentioned how I was doing some work with how mitochondrial dysfunction or impaired mitochondrial function, how that can lead to muscle wasting during aging. And I mentioned how when you think of the mitochondria, you think of its energy creating capacity, right? The powerhouse of the cell. But what I'm doing in the Chen lab is looking how a we call it bioenergetic independent. So basically, a mechanism that is different from the energy making capacity in the mitochondria and how that stress involving that can lead to muscle wasting. So essentially, what that means is the mitochondria are making energy as they should, but we're stressing them in a different way where the energy is fine in the cell, but we're still seeing muscle wasting. And this is very new to the field of mitochondrial dysfunction and muscle wasting because everyone previously has been very focused on that powerhouse nature. But now we're finding that the mitochondria have many other roles aside from just making energy that can lead to muscle pathology. And that's what I'm investigating.
So when you look at the aging aspect, are you focused on aging across the entire lifespan, or are you focused on older adults?
That's a good question. So I am focused on the entire lifespan. So we actually used a unique mouse model in which we create a genetic mutation to cause a mitochondrial stress. And what's interesting is although these mice over the entire lifespan have severe muscle wasting, their lifespan is not affected. So they can live just as long as these normal mice, but they're having this severe muscle wasting. So what I do is at different time points throughout their life, I will collect the tissue and find out exactly how the cell is responding to this mitochondrial stress. And we can see how aging affects this process.
I see. Now, what attracted you to a career in science and medicine?
Yeah, so I think it was my love for science when I was in my undergraduate institution. I knew I loved science. I loved chemistry, biology, but I also had volunteered at a hospital as well. So I love the idea of research and innovation and just advancing science. So then the question was, how can I combine a passion for basic science and medicine and treating patients? And I think that's where it brought me to the MD PhD program because I think it really nicely integrates all of my interests.
So, MD, PhD, you're working to become a doctor at the same time you're working to become a researcher.
Right, correct.
How long is the program?
Depending on the path, it could be anywhere from 8 to 9 years. And it's kind of structured in a way where it integrates both of the programs pretty nicely. So in 2018, when I started, I came in and I completed the first 2 years of medical school. So I got a pretty nice foundation for the medical sciences. And then I took a break to go complete the PhD. And that was nice because I had all of that medical knowledge from the first 2 years of medicine, which was very helpful in my research project, which has medical implications. And then I recently completed my PhD back in January of 2025, so very recently. And now I'm back to finish the final 2 years of the medical school. So I'm doing my clinical rotations now.
Oh, well, very nice. Well, thank you so much for taking time to tell us about your work.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
My guest has been Nicholas Brennan, a fellow in the MD PhD program at Upstate's Norton College of Medicine. The Informed Patient is a podcast covering health, science, and medicine brought to you by Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York, and produced by Jim Howe, with sound engineering by Bill Brokel and graphic design by Dan Cameron. Find our archive of previous episodes at upstate.edu/informed. If you enjoyed this episode, please invite a friend to listen. You can also rate and review the Informed Patient podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. This is your host, Amber Smith, thanking you for listening.